It was one of the most puzzling cases in Iowa's history. News anchor Jodi Huisentruit was kidnapped in front of her building around 4:30 a.m. in the morning of June 27, 1995, less than 2 hours before she was supposed to anchor the morning news. Nearly 30 years later, the mystery of her disappearance remains unsolved. Why was she abducted? Who was the kidnapper? Was it a stranger or someone she knew? And where is Jodi now? Join us as we investigate this decades-old puzzle to find out what most likely happened to Jodi Huisentruit. Who was Jodi Huisentruit? Jodi Huisentruit was a 27-year-old Minnesota native who worked as a television news anchor for CBS affiliate KIMT-TV in Mason City. She handled the morning and noon newscast. She also worked as a producer between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Jodi was a rising star. Her friends described her as bubbly and effervescent. She was aiming to become a news anchor in the Twin Cities. Unfortunately, she never made it. She was abducted on June 27, 1995, and was never heard from again. The day before Jodi disappeared, everything seemed normal. She anchored the morning news at KIM-TV as usual from 6 to 7 a.m. Around 9 a.m., Jodi went to the annual Mason City Chamber of Commerce golf tournament fundraiser. She was on a team with 2 local businessmen and a sales associate from KIMT-TV. There was an overflow crowd, so the team played at Highland Park Golf Course. The rain, however, forced them to stop playing. The group went to the clubhouse and socialized for a while before Jodi left mid-afternoon. She was going home to change out of her wet clothes before attending the awards dinner at the Mason City Country Club. She arrived back at the country club at 3:30 p.m., where she socialized and had dinner. 2 members of her golf team reported that Jodi had talked about getting annoying phone calls. She was planning to change her number because of this. At 8 p.m., Jodi said goodbye to her team and to her news director, Doug Murbach. She was supposedly on her way home. At 8:24 p.m., Jodi called her friend from Mississippi, Kelly Turgeson. Because Kelly wasn't at home, it was her husband who was able to talk to Jodi briefly on the phone. According to him, Jodi sounded cheerful, not worried at all. It didn't seem that anything was wrong. Jodi told him she just wanted to talk and asked if he could tell Kelly to call her if she got home before 10 p.m. She had to be up at 3 a.m. for her morning show, so she couldn't stay up any later than that. A friend of Jodi's, John Vances, told the police that Jodi had dropped by his house that night to watch an 18-minute videotape of Jodi's surprise 27th birthday party that he had hosted earlier that month. It wasn't clear how Jodi spent the next several hours or what time she arrived home that night. The next day, June 27th, Jodi was expected to arrive at 3 a.m. at the KITM-TV studio to prepare for the 6 a.m. morning show called Daybreak. When she didn't show up, people thought that she had just overslept. When Jodi still didn't appear at 4 a.m., her producer, Amy Kunz, called her. It seemed as if the call woke her up. According to Kunz, Jodi had sounded okay. Jodi told Kunz that she would be there right away. Her apartment was approximately a mile away from the studio. It would only take her 5 minutes to get to her workplace. However, at 5 a.m., Jodi still hadn't shown up. According to Kunz, she tried calling Jodi again, but there was no answer this time. Take note that this was during a time when there were no cell phones yet, so Kunz was only calling Jodi through her home phone. Because the show must go on, Kunz continued preparing for the show. When Jodi still didn't arrive at 6 a.m., Kunz anchored the hour-long newscast in her stead. When she finished the show at 7 a.m., there was still no word from Jodi. Worried about her, thinking she might have slipped in the shower or something similar, Kunz asked a co-worker to call the police to conduct a welfare check. The Mason City Police Department received a call at 7:13 a.m. They arrived at the Keys apartment complex 3 minutes later. Upon arrival, it was immediately clear to the police officers that a crime had occurred in the apartment complex's parking lot. Jodi's car, a red Mazda Miata, was still parked there, just steps from her apartment building. The police saw signs of a struggle. Jodi's car key was bent inside the lock of the door on the driver's side. Her red high heels, blow dryer and earrings lay scattered on the ground by her car. There were drag marks on the pavement. The police also found a partial palm print on the vehicle. Upon entering her apartment, the police saw nothing out of place. However, they did note that the toilet seat in her apartment was in a raised position. Since Jodi lived alone, the authorities wondered if she had a male guest over that night. It was later clarified by the MCPD chief, Jack Schleiper, that there was no evidence that indicated Jodi was with someone that night before she was abducted. While interviewing the neighbors, there were some who reported hearing screams around 4:30 a.m., but no one called the police. The neighbors dismissed them, thinking they were nothing more than just noisy campers from the nearby campground. John Vancis arrived at the scene that morning and told investigators that Jodi had stopped by his house the night before. He also told police that he and some friends had gone on a water skiing trip in Iowa City with Jodi the previous weekend. A man who lived up the street from Jodi's apartment complex reported seeing a light-colored van in the parking lot as he drove to work around 4:30 a.m. Within hours of discovering the crime scene, the police assembled search teams to cover the immediate area. The initial search extended 2 miles from the complex. Then the search was expanded to 5, then 10 miles. Eventually, the search expanded to hundreds of miles. The Mason City Fire Department even searched the Winnebago River, which ran behind the apartment complex. It was one of the largest manhunts in the history of Iowa. Despite an extensive police search, there was no sign of Jodi anywhere. 6 months after her disappearance, the police still didn't have any solid leads or suspects. Jodi's family hired private investigators and psychics. More than 1,000 interviews were conducted, but there was no conclusive evidence found that could lead law enforcement to a suspect. In May 2001, Jodi Huisentruit was declared legally dead. Her family was forced to make this incredibly tough decision in order to settle her estate. But that didn't mean that people stopped looking for her. In 2003, journalists Gary Peterson and Josh Benson created FindJodi.com. They were later joined by various former reporters and retired detective Jay Alberto. The purpose of the website was to keep a spotlight on Jodi's case, as well as to filter all the tips provided by the public. In June 2018, billboards were placed around Mason City by the FindJodi.com team, asking the public for information. This would have been Jodi's 50th birthday. In 2019, private investigator Steve Ridge started investigating Jodi's case. He discovered that Jodi had met 2 young men with a Mastercraft ski boat the weekend before she disappeared. On her water skiing trip with her friends, which included Vancis, Jodi and her friend Tammy boarded the boat. They were videotaped by the boat's owner drinking, singing, and dancing on top of the enclosed engine compartment. Reportedly, Vancis was very unhappy that Jodi left his boat. According to Ridge, witnesses stated that Vancis didn't make a scene about it, as some claim he was prone to do. The police were able to obtain a copy of the video. In addition, they were able to clear the 2 men of suspicion. In 2023, Ridge offered a $25,000 reward for anyone who could provide information leading to Jodi's remains. The amount was increased to $50,000 because he believes that money is a key motivator, something that will encourage people to spill their secrets. Though he is still investigating the case, Ridge believes that Jodi is dead. Despite the large reward, the case remains unsolved to this day. Nearly 30 years after her disappearance, there are still few answers as to what happened to Jodi Huisentruit. Though the police didn't officially name any suspects, 2 men were extensively investigated regarding their possible involvement. The first one was John Vancis, the last person to actually see Jodi alive. Vancis was a seed salesman around 20 years older than Jodi. As mentioned earlier, he had hosted a surprise birthday party for Jodi with their mutual friend, Annie Cruz. He even named his boat after her. In addition, he took her along with some friends water skiing in Iowa City the weekend before Jodi disappeared. That's not all. This recently divorced man had once lived in Jodi's apartment complex, and he was very familiar with the neighborhood. Though that's not where Jodi met him. She and Annie met Vancis at a bar. Vancis offered to buy the two women a drink. They started talking to him. Later, they started meeting him again and again. Soon, Vancis became part of Jodi's inner circle of friends. It was because of this close relationship, along with the fact that he was the last person to see Jodi alive, that the police were suspicious of him. And it wasn't only the police. Several of Jodi's friends and family also harbored suspicions about Vancis. One of her colleagues, Robin Wolfram, thought it was quite possible that Vancis had harmed Jodi. She believed that he had strong, unrequited feelings for Jodi. During an interview, he gave this statement. John Vancis to KIMT, 1995. I have named my boat after her because just because she's Jodi. You can't help but love that woman. You can't help but love her. Wolfram felt that Vancis might have been obsessed with Jodi, enough that he might have abducted her. Other friends had the same idea. When Jodi's friends learned that Vancis had named his boat after her, they warned her that it's weird. They also told her that he might come to a point where he would want more than just friendship. Unfortunately, Jodi just thought that it was cool and brushed off their concerns. During a conversation between Jodi's sister Joanne and Vancis that was filmed by 48 Hours, Vancis would talk about his friendship with Jodi. He stated that he tried to watch over her, checking in on her occasionally. He loved watching her have fun. He even stated that the men's clothes in Jodi's apartment were his. Whenever Jodi liked a shirt that he was wearing, he'd give it to her. Based on his statements, in Joanne's mind, Vancis is very obsessed with Jodi. So there's a good chance that he is involved in some way or other. And Cruz, their mutual friend, also acknowledged that Vancis was interested in Jodi. She stated that Jodi thought he understood the boundaries of their relationship. She would brush it off, saying that Vancis is like a father to her. She even did this in front of him. Initially, Annie didn't think that Vancis could ever hurt Jodi, but 25 years later, she changed her mind. She now thinks that Vancis could have harmed Jodi. When asked about the motive, she stated that it might be because he got rejected by Jodi. The question is, why did he act on that particular morning, and why in the parking lot of her building? Annie thinks it might have been because of Jodi's 1991 Miata. It was discovered that the car was not actually in Jodi's name. It was still owned by a man called John Lessard, a prominent businessman. The title transfer was still pending. The sale was arranged by a friend of Lessard's, who was a car salesman. According to LaDonna Woodford, Vancis told her that the car was a birthday gift from her boyfriend. He also told her that Jodi didn't want the car and was planning on giving it back. But Annie disagreed. According to her, Jodi was very excited about the car. She worked hard to get it and was very proud of it. In addition, she never heard Jodi talk about someone else buying the car for her. She thinks that Vancis was lying. Moreover, she stated that Vancis was often very jealous when it came to Jodi. He would make sure to join conversations she was having with other people. To her, it seemed as if Vancis wanted people to know that Jodi was his. Annie's not the only one who thinks that the car is an important detail. Private investigator Steve Ridge also believes that Jodi's car plays an important role in her disappearance. According to his investigation, Jodi was able to take possession of the car without having made any payments or finalizing the sale price. He thinks that part of the car might have been a gift from an admirer who wanted to help Jodi out. Ridge also thinks that whoever helped Jodi get the car might have answers to what happened to her. So far, nothing has turned up to provide new clues as to what happened to Jodi. More importantly, the police were unable to find any evidence to prove his involvement. The police gave him a polygraph test, which he passed. They also had a search warrant for GPS information on 2 of his vehicles. The warrant is sealed, so there's no way to know what specific information the police want to find out. The public also can't access the probable cause materials presented by the police that made the judge sign the warrant. According to investigative reporter Caroline Lowe, the police might be trying to find out if Vancis would visit a particular site where he could have buried Jodi. In March 2017, Vancis was even subpoenaed by a federal grand jury where he was ordered to submit to DNA testing. He was also asked to provide his finger and handprints. However, no incriminating evidence was found. In addition, if Vancis was truly involved, he would have only had a 90-minute window to abduct Jodi and get back home by 6 a.m. when a friend of his, LaDonna Woodford, called him on his landline. Woodford testified in front of a federal grand jury in 1997 that she talked to Vancis at this time to confirm their early morning walk. In addition, she also stated that Vancis didn't show any unusual behavior while on their walk. He even mentioned seeing Jodi the night before. Woodford also claims that Vancis always talked about Jodi like she was his daughter and that he was protecting her. She didn't see any indication that he had feelings for her. Aside from Vancis, the police also looked at a man called Tony Jackson. Around 2 years after Jodi was kidnapped, Tony Jackson was arrested and charged with several stranger rapes in the area. When the investigators in Minnesota learned that Jackson previously lived in Mason City, they informed the MCPD. Based on their investigation, they found that Jackson had an ex-girlfriend that looked a lot like Jodi. She broke up with him the week before Jodi disappeared. More importantly, Jackson lived just 2 blocks from KIMT TV at that time. It's not improbable that he may have seen Jodi on TV and watched her to learn her schedule. That's not all. Jackson's cellmate, Dennis Goff, claimed that Jackson had told him he had murdered an anchor woman. He had also written rap lyrics about what happened to Jodi. According to the lyrics, Jodi may be buried near a farm silo in Tiffin, Iowa. In addition, it was discovered that Jackson had bought a car the day before Jodi disappeared. WCCO reporter Caroline Lowe investigated Jodi's disappearance. Together with law enforcement and cadaver dogs, they searched a site in Tiffin, Iowa for possible human remains. Unfortunately, the lead didn't pan out. They didn't find anything. By 1999, the MCPD finally issued a statement concerning Tony Jackson. He was no longer considered a viable suspect. There was no forensic evidence found that could link him to Jodi's disappearance. If it wasn't Vancis or Jackson, then could it have been a stalker? The police discovered that in October 1994, Jodi reported a possible stalker. She noticed a black truck following her while she was out jogging on a trail. However, the police weren't able to learn more about the incident following an investigation. They couldn't find the vehicle or identify the driver. According to friends and Jodi's self-defense instructor, she told them a few months before she vanished that she felt she was being followed. A stalker isn't out of the realm of possibilities. Jodi, after all, was a public figure. Her home address was listed in the public phone directory, which would make it easy for anyone interested to find out. She also had a regular schedule. She worked Monday through Friday, arriving and leaving work at the same time every day. She also openly discussed her evening and weekend plans during her news broadcasts. Jerry Burns might possibly fit that bill. In 2018, DNA evidence connected him to the murder of Michelle Martinko, an 18-year-old blonde woman killed in Iowa in 1979. Aside from the fact that Martinko looks a lot like Jodi, both crimes occurred in parking lots. Martinko's case also went unsolved for decades. That's not the most important part. Burns apparently mentioned Jodi's name during his interrogation. He did this voluntarily. Unfortunately, there is no DNA evidence tying Burns to Jodi's case, nor is there any evidence that shows he knew Jodi Huisentruit, or that his life intersected with hers in any way. Another person of interest is Tom Koskadden, a convicted sex offender who lived in a general area at the time that Jodi vanished. However, the police were able to rule him out. Koskadden was eventually arrested and jailed on unrelated charges. Aside from these persons of interest, there were other theories that were bandied about regarding Jodi's disappearance. One involved a conspiracy where Jodi was killed for investigating the death of Billy Pruin. Pruin was a friend of hers who was shot inside his home in Mason City after he complained about local methamphetamine rings. Another theory that popped up was that the kidnapper was part of the Mason City Police Department. According to police officer Maria Oll, an informant told her that the police were involved in Jodi's disappearance. She even named them: Lieutenant Frank Stearns, Lieutenant Ron Van Weerd, and Bill Bassler. In fact, one of the billboards that the FindJodi.com set up was vandalized with the name of a retired Mason City Police Department investigator, Frank Stearns, accompanied with the words "Machine Shed." The police were unable to find out who vandalized it. They concluded that it was done by someone with their own agenda. One detail that was discovered later was that the MCPD used to escort Jodi to the station on occasion, though the department denied this. In addition, in the early 2010s, photocopies of Jodi's private journal that was in police custody was sent anonymously to the Mason City Globe Gazette. Months later, the wife of ex-chief of police admitted that she was the one who sent the copy. However, there was no explanation given for why she sent potential evidence to the media. It should be noted that Oll was fired due to mishandling tips received about Jodi's case. That being said, Oll is not the only one talking about a conspiracy. In 2016, retiring state representative John Kuiker of Sioux County suggested there was a cover-up by Mason City officials. His statement was based on his experience with the case as a member of the Iowa State House Public Safety Committee. Despite the speculations and accusations, there has never been any evidence found confirming that the MCPD was involved in Jodi's disappearance. With so many theories and little evidence that points to an actual suspect, it's difficult to ascertain what truly happened to Jodi Huisentruit. But we can glean some information from all the details discovered by police and other investigators. First, let's look at the crime scene. We can assume that this was not a crime of opportunity or a random act of violence. It was premeditated. Jodi was most likely abducted by someone who was very familiar with her schedule. A random person who was only vaguely familiar with her schedule would easily have thought that they missed her or that they got the schedule wrong. Only someone determined to abduct her that day would have persisted, waiting for more than an hour, knowing that she was bound to come out eventually. Now, the question we have to ask is, how did the kidnapper know that Jodi was simply running late? Aside from being familiar with her schedule and having the time to lie in wait, he would have to know that she was merely running late, not calling in sick. This leads us to believe that the person who abducted Jodi knew that she might be running late that morning. If that's the case, then it should be someone who knew what she had been doing the night before. And the only person who we know that fits that bill is John Vancis. We know that the two of them met that night to watch the videotape of Jodi's surprise birthday party. But what if this incident didn't happen at his house like he said? What if they viewed the video in her apartment instead? We know that Jodi had had a really busy day. She told the people at the country club that she was going home. She planned to turn in by 10 p.m. because she had to anchor the news early the next day. Why would she suddenly drop by Vancis's house just to view an 18-minute video after a long day? She was already home by 8:24 p.m. when she called her friend Kelly. If she had left around 8 p.m., how did she have the time to drop by Vancis's house, watch an 18-minute video, and then get home to make a phone call? If she had made the phone call before dropping by Vancis's house, why would she go out again just to watch a short video? It's quite possible that it was Vansis who turned up at her apartment that night. They may have watched a video and had a couple of drinks. There were 2 wine glasses and beer cans found in her apartment. While there was no indication on when these were consumed, the toilet seat was up in her apartment, which gives the impression that a man was in the apartment that night. Unless Jodi got drunk and vomited. We already heard from several friends and family members how Vansis had unrequited feelings for Jodi. We also know that he could be quite possessive of her. In addition, he wasn't her only admirer. Ridge revealed recently that Jodi might have been in a secret relationship which started the week before she disappeared. It's possible that Vansis discovered this that night. Or he might have made a move that night and Jodi rebuffed him. Whatever the reason may be, he might have left that night angry, frustrated, and jealous. Since he knew that Jodi was tired and had indulged in some alcohol that night, it's not that far off to assume that he predicted that she'd be running late the next day. He was someone who was very familiar with Jodi's schedule. He could have waited in the parking lot for Jodi to show up. Jodi was abducted around 4:30 a.m. Vansis lives quite near her. He could easily have taken her from the parking lot to his house or somewhere else before getting back home at 6 a.m. when LaDonna Woodford called him for their morning walk. He could have disposed of Jodi's body later that day or even the day after. Now, we know that there is very little direct physical evidence that proves our theory, but forensics during that time period was not as advanced as it is today. It's quite possible that the police missed something. We believe that this is the simplest and most straightforward theory that can explain what most likely happened to Jodi Huisentruit. Of course, other theories are also possible. The only thing we can be certain of is that the solution to this puzzling mystery can only be discovered when we find Jodi's remains. If you love our content and want to support the channel, feel free to check our web shop where you can find exclusive true crime merch brought to you by Bad Things.